Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 2 of At the Basecamp. It's your classified podcast talking about classified France 44. I'm your host, Krispy, the senior community manager at Absolutely Games. And before we get to our guest of honor, basically, I'm just going to do some quick business whilst we're here. So when this drops, the classified France 44 will be launching momentarily. So it should be coming at you thick and fast on March 5th. So if you're interested and want to get in and try out the latest World War II turn-based tactical and strategy game, Classified France 44 is your jam. Get it on Steam, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series X and S. As a little note as well, we're going to be talking about movies and TV shows sort of related to the French Resistance or just Resistance vibes. So just a general sort of spoiler warning. I think we'll try and avoid stuff where we can, but this is just a sort of general, we may be talking deep plot points and stuff like that, but also just a general warning of these might be topics that are a bit dangerous isn't the word, but uncomfortable, just because of the sort of the grim realities of living in that time and things like that. So just be careful. If you're not feeling it, you're free to drop out. But introducing our guest of honor, we have Lee Brimmicombe-Wood, the senior game designer. I think I've mispronounced just from your face.
Oh dear, Lee Brimmicombe-Wood. That's my name.
My apologies, sir. I just call you Lee on a general basis from day to day. But thank you for taking the time to be here today and basically just divulge all the information that's in your brain about Classified France 44, but more in the aspect of your influences or the things that influence you to tell this story, let's say. So, I mean, just give us a little rundown of yourself for those who haven't heard of you or haven't heard that much, let's say.
Okay, well, I am the senior designer on the project, effectively the lead designer. I'm a veteran of some 30 years in the industry, so I'm an old man now. So you may get some old man information coming out from me. And when
Wise
we began,
and sage, I would say. Sorry.
Well, yes. Maybe. When we began the project, I mean, I think we were trying to mash up a number of things that we wanted to do. We were certainly, in the early days, we were a bit concerned that quite a lot of the World War II topics had already been fairly effectively covered. I mean, we've stormed the beaches stormed Omaha Beach several times in games. We didn't really want to do that again. And so we're looking at other ideas, and I think there were two things that really jumped out at us. I mean, one was the story of the Jedburghs, who were these sort of like very much a sort of early iteration of modern special forces, and they were this mixed nationality group of special forces operatives. The teams generally were a mixture of British, American and French personnel who would parachute into France and to make contact with the resistance and create havoc on and after D-Day. However, we did make some slight changes. I mean, this is a fiction after all, so we did stretch history a little bit, and rather than parachuting on D-Day, what we actually did was have them parachuting about 2 months beforehand in our fiction. So they get to interact with the French resistance during the occupation and having to, I think, have conversations and a dialogue with their French resistance counterparts about life under occupation, which I find a really fascinating subject. And so that's kind of like the origin of where we go with Classified France 44. Is it's a game where you have a mixture of Allied and French resistance fighters all working together on a whole variety of different missions to try and essentially gum up the works of the German war machine in the run-up to D-Day. And this can be a variety of assassination, sabotage, and various other kind of interesting missions.
No, excellent. Well, thank you for being here today. And I mean, that's where I want to sort of delve into is just, obviously you say a lot of focus gets put on the beaches of Omaha, and like when I've been shown off the game, people immediately, when you mention D-Day, people are like, oh, I'm thinking of Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers. Like, I'll admit, I've been to get a vibe check on where we're going at launch. I've dropped into Band of Brothers again. It's an awesome TV show. But kind of, we want to understand like what influenced you, or like when in your life were you like, right, there's a French Resistance story that I really want to tell?
It's worth saying that, I mean, obviously Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers are much lauded films, but for me they kind of create a clear bright line in World War II cinema. Now, I know a few things about World War II cinema, and there's some topics you should not get me rabbiting away on, such as Showa-era Japanese war cinema. But I do feel as if Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers introduced a kind of a level of verisimilitude, a sort of like a gritty reality into the war movie. Being an old man, my interests in sort of World War II cinema go back a very, very long way. My early introductions, sort of almost in the 70s, were in sort of Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon war movies, which would be these big adventure tales, often involving commando operations, where you would get, I don't know, Richard Burton or Clint Eastwood would burst into a room and gun down every German soldier in there with his Schmeiser in one big burst. Which were sort of like a fantasy that appeared really sort of like in the 60s and 70s. But you go further back in war movies before then, you tend to find they're a little bit more realistic. They weren't like the action potboiler films of the 70s. They were often more realistic, and often the people acting in them were people who had actually been in the war. And you get some really extraordinary cases like Richard Todd, who was a big name British actor in the post-war period. He was in movies like The Dam Busters, for example, where he played Guy Gibson. But he was also had himself been in the war, had been in I can't remember what regiment he was in exactly, but he was one of the men who dropped on Pegasus Bridge on D-Day. And so when they came to cast him in The Longest Day, he was there telling the director, where they were shooting at Pegasus Bridge, he was telling them the action and where people were and what he was doing and so on. And he was essentially playing his own commanding officer in that film. So you've got this kind of like a sort of through line, if you like, of immediately after the war you have these sort of very realistic war movies. Then in the late 60s and 70s you start getting these much more fantasy-based war movies, which are much more like the sort of airport lounge paperback thrillers that people were buying in that era. And then you get through to Saving Private Ryan, and it almost sort of turns it around again, and we go back to wanting to be more authentic and wanting to be more real. So there's definitely sort of like a different vibes and different tones, and I have to confess that certainly one of the influences on Classified is a little bit that sort of Saturday afternoon turning on the TV and watching Richard Burton parachute into some part of Germany and start slaughtering Germans by the handful. There's a little bit of that going on in what we're doing, but we're also trying to at the same time, which we're trying to be true to some of the history, try and represent I think really a much more complicated situation than many people realise was happening in France on the run-up to D-Day.
I know it's definitely opened my eyes, because before I joined on the project, like, you hear about the French Resistance and stuff and you go, oh, yeah, the French Resistance, it's just one thing. But then joining the project and like seeing the factions within our game, and a catchphrase you've said many times is the French Resistance wasn't a monolith. I think it's great that we sort of were representing that and expanding that knowledge in a way.
It wasn't, and we have to be very, very careful, tread very carefully when it comes to the French resistance, because French cultural memory, and this is a very sensitive issue, is a little bit slippery when it comes to the resistance. I used to live in Sweden for a few years, and I remember talking to a Danish colleague who said that that basically after the liberation of Denmark, everybody and their uncle had claimed to have been in the Danish resistance. And of course, there was a similar thing. Well, a very big thing in France that was very, very similar. Everybody sort of came out hiding, said, "Oh, I was in the resistance." Yeah, right, buddy. And of course, de Gaulle, I think, in the post-war era, was very keen to try and unify the country. I don't think people realise how split the nation was. There was enormous schisms in French society. Sorry, I'm going to get historical here for a moment. I hope you don't mind.
Go wildly. This is what we're here for.
You have to remember that France, when it fell and came under German occupation or partial German occupation, I mean, it was still only 40-odd years, less than 40-odd years since the Dreyfus affair had finished in France, which was essentially a scandal of the turn of the century, which had revealed an awful lot of cleavages in French society and the kind of conflicts between Catholic clericalism and anti-clericalism, and it was all tied up in this narrative about a French officer who happened to be Jewish, who was accused of passing secrets to the Germans. And so in some ways what was happening in France in 1940 through to 44, 45 was still echoing a lot of these sort of quite old cleavages in French society. And so when the Germans came, there were some French who welcomed it, and there were some French who were very much on board with the German programme, particularly when it came to anti-Semitism. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in France in that period. And where you find the resistance initially is not necessarily in the more conservative elements, but actually in the more radical elements. It was the first people to start resisting were the socialists, the communists, the students. In many ways, you might call them the usual suspects. And it was interesting that as the war went on, the increasingly harsh German crackdown started to put more and more segments and sectors of French society into the resistance camp. I mean, if you like, the Germans did an incredibly good job of helping radicalise many French into resisting. So the resistance became stronger as time went on. But you still have these various different factions. A very important historical figure in this is a man called Jean Moulin, and I think you should try and look him up if you can. He was an extraordinary fellow. And one of the things he was a radical. He came from a very left-wing background, but he got in good with the Gaullists, and he helped essentially unite an awful lot of the resistance, so that I think it's by about 1943, there was sort of like a combined command that he helped essentially broker, and then unfortunately he was caught and killed just a couple of months later. But again, an extraordinary hero of the resistance. But the resistance was never entirely a monolith, even after Moulin had managed to kind of unite an awful lot of it under a single command. Essentially, it was still kind of jostling. It was various different factions jostling for positions after the war. And there was a lot of politics that was tied up in the resistance this time, and they were very much looking at what the post-war landscape is. And this is something I want to try and represent in the game, and it's represented by some of the characters that we have in the story. I mean, we kind of made a decision very early on that we did not want to have anonymous characters in the same way that you see in competitor games.
Yeah.
Where you can create your character, you can build them out of parts, but they're essentially disposable and you can throw them away. We wanted to have them tell their stories, and that meant really having characters who didn't die. I mean, they might get injured, they might go away, they might be ineffective because of injury or whatever. But you still keep them to the end. In fact, you even get little aftermaths, see what they get up to after the war, which is itself kind of an interesting subject. But they represent very different poles. Some of them are obviously allied. We have Americans, we have British, we have Canadians, we have Australians. They come in with their stories. I mean, some of those are quite interesting. Americans who'd already fought bits of the war at places like Kasserine, or the Australian who'd been in the Lebanon and fighting the Vichy French, and suddenly finds himself going from fighting the Vichy French to fighting with the French resistance. They have stories to tell, and some of them are members of the resistance, and they come from very different backgrounds. We have one who is a student, or a former student, who is undoubtedly is a communist. He's but he comes with a certain position. He comes with a certain agenda. It's not necessarily what you might expect. I mean, for example, by the time of the run-up to D-Day, an awful lot of the French communists had essentially had set their face against Stalinism, and they were not at all interested in Stalin. And so, this is this sort of bits of storytelling is reflected in what's going on. But these people also, at the same time, they live in this era. They live they're marinated in the culture of the late 30s and early to mid 40s. So our French student, for example, he's a connoisseur of movies, in particular American westerns, and so there's some interesting conversations that sometimes come out between the characters on these sorts of subjects. Sorry, I sort of wandered off track there, but I was sort of trying to make a point that this is a very, very complex situation, and the people that lived in those times often had very interesting stories to tell, and they weren't necessarily all stories of sacrifice or trauma. They were maybe about hope for the future. They were perhaps about what the post-war order was going to be like, and in some cases they are having conversations about the price of butter, which at times actually exceeded the price of beef in occupied France on the black market. So there are many, many stories that we want to tell there.
I quite like in Classified as well, even though your recruits will hang out at the base camp, not everyone's going to be chums, especially these people from different factions. So it's those kind of complexities, I think. I especially enjoy just when I get to go to the base camp. I've had a harrowing mission, let's say, and getting some relief from people joining, or a little combative snipping at each other.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of arguments that these people have. There's the student I was just talking about, for example, if he gets talking with the American officer, they might well have a conversation about what's going to happen in the post-war, and the student's basically going, well, we thank you Americans very much for helping us out, throw the Germans out of our country, but when the war's over, can you just go home? And the American officer's going, well, what if we don't? And the student just says, well, we'll start fighting you. So I'm trying to represent some of those tensions.
Yeah, in a bit of a cliche way, a bit of the enemy of my enemy is my friend for now, sort of thing.
Oh, I think for some of these people, the alliances were very much alliances of convenience.
Yeah.
And yes, communists fighting alongside, capitalist Americans. Well, I mean, we saw what happened there with regards to, America and the Soviet Union. We very quickly fell out after the war.
So we've touched on, whilst we were talking there, a bit of cinema influence and stuff like that. before we get into the actual questions, I just wanted to throw your mind back, if you can, a year ago when we were trying to get the key art put together, and we were working on that. James Brooksby made his stick figure implementation, but then we actually, I think, drew from the influences that you might be talking about here, and to sort of make a collage of the hero composition that we wanted. So we had things like Andor or the poster of the Dirty Dozen and Where Eagles Dare, and we'd done that. So I'll say, like, the cinema influences that you've brought here, it's not just within the game, but I mean everything surrounding the game.
Oh yes, I mean there's a lot of cinema influence, I have to say. But again, because my interest in war movies, it's maybe some movies that you might not have heard of before or might not have encountered. I mean, there's quite a few. There are some that I think are relatively well known in certainly in Britain and possibly America. I mean, there have been some quite famous films about some of the women involved with the resistance. I mean, Charlotte Gray with Cate Blanchett, or Carve Her Name with Pride is a good example of this. But I mean, I was also drawing from movies made by the French themselves, which in some ways are very, very interesting. I mean, there's a few good examples, like This Land Is Mine by Jean Renoir. Mm-hmm. This was done after Renoir had kind of fled France for Hollywood, and so he's making a Hollywood film about the resistance with Charles Lawton in the lead. But there's others as well, particularly post-war films. The Battle of the Rails, which is kind of an interesting film that looks at the efforts by the resistance in conjunction with the railway workers to sabotage the French railway system, which was actually a really important part of the run-up to D-Day. I mean, Bomber Command played a notable influence here in trying to bomb the French railway system and develop low-level marking, which made them actually pretty accurate in that stage of the war. But the railway workers themselves were working to sabotage the railroads. There are other films as well. Line of Demarcation's an interesting one, particularly since it deals with what happens in a French village as all the members of the village watch their Jewish neighbours slowly disappear. It's quite a harrowing film. Yeah. There's more recent ones like Free Men, which I think covers the subject of Maghrebi French citizens, people from Algeria and Morocco, who are in Paris helping do things like squirrel refugees away to either the free zone or to other safe spaces such as Switzerland. And of course, there's one of the great films about the subject was a film called Army of Shadows by Jean-Pierre Melville. Melville, interestingly enough, is not his real name. That was actually his
code name, right?
Code name, yes, when he was in the Resistance. And so he made this incredible film, Army of Shadows, which I'm afraid you can only find on like very expensive Blu-rays, but it's well worth. I had a look. Well worth hunting out, because it's a tale of that's not got lots of excitement in it, I'm afraid to say. It's a tale of middle-aged men in a grubby environment, somehow running from one safe house to the next safe house, and sometimes having to make really, really tough decisions. I mean, there's this one scene, I think, where they go somewhere to the south of France, I can't remember where, and they end up in a room with somebody who's informed on them, and it's just two men in a room with this guy who's informed on them, and they're rather clinically talking to each other about how they're going to kill him. And it's really quite grim stuff, and it has an ending that's absolutely incredible, that really does get to the heart of the sacrifice of people in the resistance, because their life spans were not very long, with the Gestapo on their heels, or the various other counterinsurgency forces that were on their heels. There's an awful lot of these people got caught and then tortured and disappeared.
I think that's one of the sadder parts, right? Is there was these people working for the resistance and stuff, and they a lot of them just didn't know what their actions surmounted to, right? Like they did their work and unfortunately may have been killed off or taken as prisoners of war, and don't get to see what their actions and the consequences of those actions sort of led to, in a way, which is quite, like you say, harrowing and bleak.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, they had to operate on faith that somehow what they were doing was making a difference, and they might not get much information through the chain of command, particularly since later on, or even from the early days of the resistance, they were sort of all broken up into lots of different cells, so that it was hard to roll up whole networks if any individual cell was betrayed. So it must have been incredibly difficult in that period to operate, when you really didn't have a very far horizon to look at.
So you mentioned Army of Shadows there. Are we going to take that as one of the influences? Because
definitely.
Let's do the top.
It very much in terms of the tone, I think. Again, because it is a 1960s movie, and it's very cold and it's sort of very grubby, and I'd say that and Battle of the Rails is also something that is quite similar. But then I think if you are looking at other kind of cinema influences or top fives and so on, then you do start edging into other areas, including those sort of old classic films like Operation Crossbow, which was about the sabotage attempts against the V weapons. I don't necessarily want to do a top five, because it sometimes lists are very difficult. They all kind of bring something interesting to the party.
Nope, that's perfectly fine and reasonable. So let's focus on Army of Shadows then. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to view it, as you say. It's tough to come by. Looking at the price on Amazon, but one of the things, whilst I was doing research and the clips I got to see, there wasn't much dialogue from the clips that I could see. That's possibly because it's a French movie and people weren't trying to clip those bits out.
It's very much a film in which people do things. Yes. They don't need to talk. In fact, sometimes you're in an environment where talking costs.
Yes.
So no, they were men of action.
Yeah, but
very much so.
The clips that I was seeing and the bits of reviews or retrospectives, it was the tension from no dialogue happening, and then mixed with the bleakness of from one video that I was watching, someone described it as you might even think it was black and white, because it's just so grey and lose.
Yeah, I think you could easily watch that film in black and white and not notice very much. It's very much that kind of 60s movie stock, which is just a little bit flat. It's not bright Hollywood lit, it's Northwest European lit, and so ever so slightly grey. In terms of the visuals, it's very cold looking, without a doubt.
So it seems like more of an art question, but I think I want to try and get a seed of in Classified, it's not as bleak and grey and dark as Army of Shadow, let's say. So was that a deliberate point that we didn't want to just drag people through the emotions or make them feel down?
There was it was one of the earliest discussions we had on the game was on the visuals, and one of the things we wanted there was it to be quite bright. In fact, the very early discussions were revolving around the fact that we'd seen Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan, and ever since then all of these films are desaturated. Everything, even the games are as well. All the visuals are desaturated, and you get the impression that the whole kind of the past was somehow desaturated. It's almost like as mad as making everything in the past look sepia or something. It's just it's a bit of a shame, really, because obviously the past was quite a bright thing. It was interesting. We went back and forth on the colour palette. a few times, and I know that again early on we were trying to go for something bright. In the end, we did desaturate very slightly to try and find where we are, but I don't think we've gone quite the extent to which some other games on World War II have. So there's definitely a lot more colour in our game.
Excellent. And then you were mentioning earlier that which film was it where someone played his own commanding officer?
Oh, Richard Todd in The Longest Day, yes.
So on my research, I found that there's a character within Army of Shadows who actually plays himself in the movie.
That's news to me. That's fantastic.
It's a colonel. I don't have the name to hand, but as you mentioned, Jean-Pierre Melville, he was in the French Resistance, and then Army of Shadows was based on the book. Well, the film is based on the book Army of Shadows, but there's considerable differences, I hear. But the book written by Joseph Kessel, who was also in the French Resistance, written in 1943, if I'm correct. So, I mean, of course, they want to tell this story. So, I mean, not to be rudely, but I don't think you're in the French Resistance. If you were, you're looking fabulous.
No, I'm not that old.
I mean, just like, I can understand why they have like a personal reason that they want to share this, but like, why do you?
I've just sort of got a sort of generalised interest in counterinsurgency, and it's been something I've been studying for some years. And so, obviously, when we think of counterinsurgency, we think of much more recent wars. When I was growing up, there was Vietnam, was in the news quite a lot. But then later we had to, more recent years, we had to deal with Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. There's an element to the French Resistance in that it obviously resembles many of these other counterinsurgencies. So I wanted to try and get a little bit of that vibe, that little bit sort of the cat and mouse thing that's going on between resistance and occupiers.
Oh, amazing. Which other influences? We've got Army of Shadows, Rail Bridges, anything?
Yes, I mean, I think we did touch on I think you mentioned earlier, Andor, Star Wars Andor, which is an extraordinary show. I can't help feel but Tony Gilmore, who was the showrunner on that, has actually watched some of these films and is familiar with them. And I find that interesting because it does sort of lay out in some ways how a resistance is built. I don't know whether you're kind of familiar with the sort of like the Maoist doctrine on resistance movements.
No, but please go ahead.
Well, there's Mao, as we all kind of know him now as Chairman Mao. The Vietnamese had something similar called the Dao Tran, and it was all kind of like based on the idea that resistances evolve through various stages, and obviously Mao and the Vietnamese were very much looking at this as a political perspective, and where they began, the kind of the first stage of their resistance was essentially organisation and building, if you like, a redoubt or a base from which they could operate. And many cases, doing that organisation was very much a political thing. In the case of, for example, the Vietnamese, people missed the fact that the Viet Cong, or as it was then known, National Liberation Front, was actually a mixture of a lot of very, very politically disparate groups, and that there had to be considerable work done to try and get all those people with very different agendas working together. And we sort of see that in Star Wars Andor as well, is that the rebellion or resistance, as it were, starts off very, very fragmented and is far from being a united fighting force, and in some cases is just hiding out in caves somewhere, as Saw Gerrera does. And in many ways, this reflects what the French resistance was up to as well. I mean, the Maquis more or less just hid out in the forests, the enormous French forests, where they're relatively safe from being found by the Germans. But that was the basis from which they could then build their strength and strike. And then the sort of second stage of the sort of Maoist insurgency was, if you like, increasing their activity, which is a mixture of increasing terror, or the amount of terror that they were using against the people to kind of make their signature moves and to build their brand, as it were. And some of that involved taking on enemies in isolated outposts. Again, the French resistance did very, very similar things, but in Andor we get to see this with things like the heist on Aldani. And then at some stage, whenever you've built sufficient strength, then you can go to kind of open fighting, and you can then take on the enemy, the occupying force, in a kind of open battle of manoeuvre. In the case of the French resistance, of course, didn't really happen until after D-Day, when a lot of the resistance forces could come out of hiding and start actually battling. But again, if you go to Star Wars, I suppose you get Rogue One is that moment where the military force starts to be employed as in the open.
Yeah, because I'll admit I didn't jump onto Andor when it first came out. I was at that stage, I was kind of burnt out with Star Wars, as I think some people have. It's going in a direction that maybe some people just don't enjoy. But the real thing that stood out for me with Andor is, with Star Wars, you've got like your good guys and the bad guys, like throughout the main films. But then it gets to Andor, and the space magic is like far, far away, and what we end up is actually, I think, a lot more realistic characters and people who have their own motivations and things. Like, there's people who are working with the bad side, but maybe just because out of necessity, because they want to feed their family and continue living on. That's what I've taken from it so far. I mean, do you agree?
You see this in some of the other films as well. I mean, like Free Men, I think, has one Algerian man who ends up getting recruited into becoming an informant, and there's a similar thing in Army of Shadows, where an important character ends up being compromised and then having to work for the German security services. And you're seeing, many different stories, many of which are kind of quite messy and unpleasant. There's nothing clean about this particular war. Interestingly, one of the most famous French movies on the subject was actually a comedy.
A comedy?
Yeah. La Grande Vaudreuil.
Okay.
That's my terrible French, which in many ways is much more like sorry, again, I'm kind of being old here. There's a famous old British TV drama on the BBC called Secret Army, and one of the things it seemed to have spawned was a show called Allo Allo, but La Grande Vaudreuil is also another, I think, influence on that, and it's a slightly comic film about three British airmen who sort of end up parachuting out of their bomber over Paris, and then they have to kind of like meet up with the resistance, and then have to kind of squirrel themselves away to the free zone in the south. So it becomes this sort of weird comedy of having to try and dodge, dress up in silly costumes and dodge patrols and do various comedic things. And it's actually one of the it's one of the biggest and most famous French films on the subject. It's well worth checking out.
Is that would you say more comical than Oh What a Lovely War?
I'd say so, yes.
Yeah,
without a doubt. But it definitely gets slapstick in places.
Okay. I'll actually be interested to watch that. As a note, if there's anything Lee's said here or references, I'm going to try and find them, links in the description below, just for people to go find them themselves if they're so interested. We're close to wrapping up here, Lee, but any other influences or anything that you wanted to share with the lovely folks at home?
I think there's just too many influences to call on. I mean, obviously, I was drawing in many cases. I mean, I draw on cinema in many ways for the tone. But I was drawing on history as much as possible for a lot of background material, and sort of very much trying to give a sense of what these people were like and the world in which they lived, which was a lot more complicated. It's a lot more complicated narrative than maybe some films or some media present. Certainly one of the things I really wanted to avoid in terms of the tone was too much of what I think of as the trauma of war. People being very, very traumatized by it. I mean, they undoubtedly are, but let's face it, a lot of the people that fought these battles, most of them got through it. Perhaps the trauma didn't emerge until a much, much later date. But at the time, when they were on the job, many of them just cracked on and got things done.
No time to think about it in a way. Just
I mean, if you cracked, you were dead.
Yeah.
So many of the people just got on with it. And the things that really occupied their attention was, in some cases, mixture of the profane and the mundane and the ordinary, and as I say, everything from the price of butter, which was indeed very, very expensive, to what collaborators are up to. I mean, there's a discussion at one point, I think, in the game where they're talking about how the farmers made out during the occupation, because the farmers in many cases had a good war. Something that's not really talked about very much, but the Germans didn't really occupy the countryside except at various strong points, and so it's not uncommon for many farmers to have only occasional contact with the Germans, and yet they were obviously a source of food supply, and in a lot of cases the cities were coming to them. They would either be having people coming out of the cities to try and forage for food, or people coming out to purchase direct from the farmers, or black marketeers who are doing deals with these people. And in many cases it was sort of like a quite prosperous time for many of the farmers. And so there's this kind of element of, what are they? Are they collaborators, or are they people who are just doing really well, or whatever? And there's bits of that discussion that sort of try to make it in. And I don't try and dwell too much in the game on things like atrocities. They were there. They did happen. We know about them. We know the dangers that these people lived under. And there's certainly a tension, I think, in the air. What was one of the things I wanted to get into the conversations was, in some cases, the fact that they were people living in a very tense environment under stress. But they're having jokes, and they're talking about things that happened before the war, or things they want to do after the war, or there's one of the, and some of these are based on real stories as well. There's one of the stories that I remember borrowing was a character called Tom King in the game, who's an English officer, and I gave his recruitment story where when he got his call-up papers, he was dressed in Gestapo uniform. And we find out that the reason he was in Gestapo uniform is that he was a bit part actor, and he's on the set of a very thinly disguised version of the movie Pimpernel Smith, which is a film you should watch if you possibly can. And this is actually based on a true story. It was actually of an RAF pilot who was indeed a bit part actor of that era, and was when he got his call-up papers, he was on the set at Denham Studios dressed as a Nazi.
It'd be a wild ride, I imagine, or a train of emotions and thoughts, like very conflicted as you're in that character.
No doubt. But yes, he was. I like these little stories, these little vignettes of life in wartime, which are not necessarily what you often see in war movies, where I think they're far too concerned with trying to draw out the hurt and the trauma.
And also something you don't see in like these types of games, right? As you say, in competitors, people usually create the stories outside of the game. Let's say that they make a team of their.
Oh yes, I mean I'm sure we've all done it where we make our own team, we give them our own names. In my case, it's always the names of my favourite movie actors and so on. And it was always sad whenever Sean Connery was killed. But we usually say we make our own stories, and that was an option that was definitely on our. That we had in front of us, that we did discuss quite intensely at one stage during development. But I think the way we went allowed us to get a lot more complicated stories in, and I'm hoping that people enjoy them.
I'll definitely say the base camp sections are one of my favourite parts. Like I was saying, you've come out of a mission, you've got through by the skin of your teeth, and then there's some gameplay benefit, of course, getting your morale back up, but just those little tidbits here and there of their personal lives and their thoughts and feelings. It's a big,
and arguing
big
over music. Yeah, that was also an important thing.
Hey, it happens today, right?
Of course.
Well, thank you so much, Lee, for taking the time out of your day to talk to me about Classified France 44. Onwards, right, to launch day. It's an exciting time. So if you're listening and you are interested in Classified France 44, you're able to pre-order right now on Steam, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S. If you enjoyed this episode, please do give it a 5-star in your podcast catcher of choice. And before we go, Lee, is there anywhere where people, like anything you want to plug, where people can get more of your insights or reviews, let's say? Do you have a Letterboxd profile that's public?
Sorry, you've caught me out there. I don't really have that, so you may want to cut this little bit of the dialogue.
Oh, hey, it's real and it's fine. Don't worry about it. All right, until next time, folks, when Operation Overlord will be a go. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.